Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. Just wanted to share with the House that I'm really reserving the time for Mr. Butterfield of North Carolina, but I will begin. I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Butterfield, for leading this special order hour this evening. You know, our nation was founded on principles of liberty and justice for some, but not for all. In fact, it took 89 years after the Declaration of Independence and a brutal civil war to finally end most forms of slavery. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified on December the 6th, 1865, ending slavery but preserving involuntary servitude for some incarcerated persons. After a raging debate, former slaveholders in southern states held enough influence to preserve the practice and were able to include a loophole in the 13th Amendment to continue to allow slavery as punishment for a crime. And over the next 155 years, that punishment clause was used as a club to over-incarcerate African Americans and other minorities for profit and in complete violation of their human dignity. Black Americans were immediately targeted and arrested by law enforcement for minor infractions, and the practice of forced prison labor began and still persists to this day. That is why I joined by Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon introduced legislation to amend the Constitution to clarify that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude may be used as punishment for a crime. I am pleased that many of my colleagues, including Congressman Cedric Richmond and the incoming Assistant Speaker, Congresswoman Catherine Clerk, and many of my colleagues in the CBC and broader Tri-Caucus have also taken a leadership role on this issue in legislation, confronting and rooting out the systemic racism that is still rampant in many facets of American life requires us to examine the painful truth in order to fix it. It is an indisputable historical fact that many local and state law enforcement practices in this country grew out of the legacy of racism and slavery. And as millions of Americans are demanding criminal justice reform and a change in the training and culture of policing, passage of this constitutional amendment would send a clear signal. Bigotry and profits will no longer be used to deny any person their dignity. Our criminal justice system and laws cannot be fully respected until we end this injustice that allows disproportionate numbers of black and brown people to be imprisoned and enslaved. As I retire from Congress next month, I urge my colleagues to make passage of this legislation an urgent national priority. America cannot heal and move forward until we have real equality for all instead of just for some. And I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll yield back the balance of my time.
And yields back. The chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker,
Madam Secretary.
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has agreed to, without amendment, H. Conrad's 125, directing the Clerk of the House of Representatives to make a correction in the enrollment of H.R. 1830.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3, 2019, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Butterfield, for the remainder of the hour, as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Yes. Mr. Speaker, thank you so very much for allowing us time this evening. As we prepare to get started, I will yield to the gentlelady from California, the distinguished chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, Congresswoman Karen Bass.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to commemorate the 155th anniversary of the ratification of the 13th Amendment. On December 18, 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified, officially ending more than 256 years of enslavement in the United States for nearly 4 million enslaved African Americans. The 13th Amendment provides that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. After the Civil War, the 13th Amendment was one of the first of three Reconstruction amendments adopted. The loophole sentence, however, except as a punishment for crime, allowed for African Americans to continue cruel involuntary labor, under which is known as the Black Codes. To be enslaved, specific laws were passed to ensure that African Americans would be constantly arrested, and then the government would lease human beings out as African Americans continued to be viewed as property, leased people out to businesses, farms, and other types of profit-making ventures. I would like to acknowledge the former chair of the Congressional Black Caucus and CBC's resident historian to lead this special order hour acknowledging this very important anniversary. And I yield.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Bass, for those very kind words, and thank you for your friendship and thank you for your leadership over the last 2 years as you have led the 55 men and women of the Congressional Black Caucus. I certainly know from past experience it is a daunting challenge to lead such a caucus, but thank you so very much for your leadership, and I look forward to the future leadership of our new chair, Congresswoman Joyce Beatty. Today, the Congressional Black Caucus is convening to present a special order recognizing the 155th anniversary of the ratification of the 13th Amendment. And so, Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members will have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks on this special order. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have said for years that the passage and ratification of the 13th Amendment is one of the most significant pieces of legislation ever considered by this body. Had Congress and the states failed to eliminate the despicable institution of slavery, the American experiment would have failed, and failed miserably. And so this afternoon, the Congressional Black Caucus lifts up this American history for the American people to see and understand. In the year 1860, the Republican candidate for president was Abraham Lincoln. 3 candidates opposed Lincoln: Stephen Douglas of Illinois, representing the northern wing of the Democratic Party; John Breckinridge of Kentucky, representing the southern wing of the Democratic Party; and John Bell of Tennessee, representing the Constitutional Union Party. During this election, Mr. Speaker, the southern states, the slave-holding southern states, were fearful. They were very fearful that if elected, Abraham Lincoln would find a way to end slavery and deprive them of their slaves. Over a period of 240 years, southern plantation owners had purchased African citizens who had been transshipped to the United States from the continent of Africa. The original Constitution, which was effective March 4th, 1789, addressed the issue of slavery. It contained a provision that would maintain the slave trade for at least 20 years after the ratification of the Constitution until January 1st of 1809. Though the legal end of the slave trade occurred in 1809, slave trafficking continued, to be sure. Slave women, were impregnated by males of both races and encouraged to bear large numbers of children. By 1860, Mr. Speaker, there were nearly 4 million slaves in the United States, mostly in southern states. The border states of Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, and West Virginia also had a large number of states, a large number of slaves. On November 6 of 1860, Mr. Speaker, it was the presidential election. The American voters spoke, and did they speak loudly? Abraham Lincoln became the 16th president of the United States of America, winning a very large number of electoral votes. Immediately following his election, 11 southern states began seceding from the Union. And that's the map I have here to my left. The first state to secede was South Carolina, right away on December the 20th. Mississippi, January 9th, followed by Florida and Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. And then after those 7 states had seceded from the Union, Abraham Lincoln takes the oath of office and becomes the 16th president of the United States. The oath of office took place on March 3rd. Today, as we all know, it's January 20th. But during those times, it was March 3rd. After Lincoln was installed and inaugurated as president, 4 more states seceded from the Union. They were Virginia and Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. Now, Mr. Speaker, the United States is faced with a constitutional crisis of monumental proportions. 11 states, these 11 southern states, are now considering themselves a separate nation. They refer to themselves as the Confederate States of America. The so-called Confederate States were formally created on March the 11th, a mere 8 days following Lincoln's inauguration. The Confederate States of America adopted a constitution. They created a currency, elected its political leaders, stood up a military, and adopted a flag, and attempted to do everything a developing nation would do. Great tension now existed between the 23 Union states and the 11 Confederate states. And so, Mr. Speaker, we all know what happened then. On April 12th of 1861, at 4:30 in the morning, Confederate soldiers opened fire upon Union soldiers at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, in the city of Charleston, and the Civil War begins. It was a brutal war. Southern states had declared war on the Union. Thousands of soldiers lost their lives on both sides of the battle lines. President Lincoln, Mr. Speaker, became very weary. The war was taking its toll on him. It was taking its toll on the democracy. And so on September 22nd, 1862, Lincoln issued what we now know as the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, announcing that if the rebels did not end the fighting and rejoin the Union by January 1st of 1863, 100 days later, all slaves in the rebellious states would be free. And on January 1st of 1863, Lincoln did what he threatened he would do. President Lincoln, using his power as commander-in-chief of the military, issued an executive order. That order is referred to as the historic Emancipation Proclamation. Mr. Speaker, that proclamation is often recited, and I will recite it here today. It reads as follows. This is the Emancipation Proclamation. It says that on the first day of January, in the year of our Lord, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be thenceforward and forever free. And the executive government of the United States, including the military and the naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons, and will do no act or acts to repress such persons or any of them in any efforts they make for their actual freedom. End of quote. A very powerful executive order by President Lincoln. But, Mr. Speaker, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was monumental. It proclaimed that slaves residing in the states that were in armed rebellion against the Union were free. Union military forces descended upon southern states to quiet the rebellion and to bring freedom to the slaves. But, Mr. Speaker, there was great dispute among the legal scholars of that day as to the legal effect of the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln took the position that as commander-in-chief, he possessed the authority to enter orders that would deprive the enemy of any instruments that would aid them in winning the war. The slaves were a major asset to the slaveholders who were in rebellion. And so Lincoln took the position that he possessed the power, the absolute power as commander-in-chief to free the slaves. But some scholars argued that the legal effect of the proclamation was doubtful. It was a singular act of the president, they said, without congressional approval or a popular vote. Some questioned whether the effect of the proclamation would cease at the end of the war. Some questioned how the Supreme Court would rule if the president's order was eventually judicially reviewed. And so on April 4th, 1864, right in the middle of the war, Mr. Speaker, just before the presidential election, the United States Senate passed a 13th Amendment to the Constitution, and it needed the approval of this body, the House of Representatives, for it to become law. But House approval was uncertain. And so 7 months later, after it had passed the Senate, 7 months later, on November 8th, 1864, Lincoln was then reelected. Lincoln was determined now to take ownership of this legislation to abolish slavery. Lincoln demanded that this body, the House of Representatives, pass the legislation that had been passed by the Senate. Lincoln's election platform had promised that slavery would be abolished by amendment. Lincoln demanded action. White Northern abolitionists, black abolitionists demanded action. The war was now at a fever's pitch. Abolition, Mr. Speaker, had to happen. And on January 31st, 1865, finally, the House of Representatives, this body, finally took up the question of passage of the 13th Amendment. When the vote was taken that day, the 13th Amendment passed by a two-vote margin above the needed two-thirds majority. The vote was 119 to 56. History reports, Mr. Speaker, that the galleries in this chamber, the galleries which I see at this moment, the galleries were boisterous. There were applauses. Women and men cried. They waved their handkerchiefs as the House of Representatives passed the 13th Amendment. It was a grand event. And so, Mr. Speaker, in the final vote, all 86 House Republicans voted in favor of the 13th Amendment, along with 15 Democrats, 14 unconditional unionists, and 4 union men. The opposition came from 50 Democrats and 60 union men. To amend the Constitution, not only does an amendment need to pass both houses of Congress, but it must be ratified by 3/4 of the states. And so, after the passage by the Senate and the House, the ratification process begins. On February 1st, 1865, the very next day, the following day, though not required, President Lincoln signed the 13th Amendment beginning ratification. It had to be ratified by 27 states, and ratification is now underway. The first state, as you can imagine, Mr. Speaker, was Lincoln's home state of Illinois. The very next day, February 1st, 1865, followed by Michigan and Maryland, New York, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Missouri, Maine, Kansas, Massachusetts, Virginia, Ohio, Indiana, Nevada, Louisiana, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Vermont, Tennessee, in Arkansas. And later that day, Arkansas, which is Mr. Davis's home state, I saw Mr. Davis walk on the floor a moment ago, Arkansas ratified the amendment on April 14th of 1865, and later that day, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated here in Washington, D.C. But ratification continued, and they needed 6 more states. And so May 4th, 1865, it was Connecticut, followed by New Hampshire, followed by South Carolina, followed by Alabama, and then my home state of North Carolina on December 4th, 1865. And then finally, Mr. Speaker, on December 6th of 1865, the final state of Georgia ratified the 13th Amendment. When the state of Georgia ratified the 13th Amendment on December 6, 1865, 245 years of slavery legally ended. 4 million slaves are free. The former slaves now began a long and difficult period of Reconstruction. In 1868, the former slaves became citizens with the 14th Amendment. They obtained the right to vote in 1870 under the 15th Amendment. And so in closing, Mr. Speaker, December 6th is Abolition Day in America, and we should observe it and recognize this history. As elected members of Congress, black and white, Democrat and Republican, we must rededicate ourselves to the complete elimination of intentional and systemic racism in America. Mr. Speaker, this is our challenge. Thank you so very much for yielding time. At this time, it is my pleasure to yield. Is Mr. Clyburn on the floor? It is my pleasure to yield to Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas. 3 minutes. At this time, I will recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Congressman Danny Davis of Chicago, Illinois, for 3 minutes.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, the period during which slavery legally existed represents the most horrific and most sordid period in the history of the United States. Therefore, I commend and thank Representative G.K. Butterfield for facilitating and anchoring this special order, highlighting the importance, relevance, and impact of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments on change in America. Of course, we know that the 13th abolished slavery, the 14th gave blacks and former slaves citizenship, and the 15th Amendment gave newly freed slaves the right to vote. The period preceding, during, and after the Civil War, known as Reconstruction, is not only one of the most sordid, but also the most violent and most repressive period in our history. The most interesting part of all of this, though, is not yesterday. The most interesting part is that there are individuals and groups in our country today who are attempting to take us back to that period. And GK, we can never let that happen. In the U.S. News today, there's an article defining how some historians, some boards of education, some school boards have attempted to rewrite and teach a history that is very different than the real history. When you consider the number of individuals who are part of the mass incarceration system, who are forced to work for nothing, and whose rights are suspended, that takes us back a ways. And when you consider efforts to prevent and make it difficult or basically impossible for people to vote, that nullifies the 15th Amendment. So you see, Brother Butterfield, when you consider the times that we're in, one would have to conclude that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are all under serious attack. And we must glory in the fact that we have overcome some of the obstacles, but we also must be vigilant to the extent of never going back to that period. We must be able to say, even as a 12-year-old girl said when she wrote a little poem that said, "No chains on my hands, no chains on my feet, but the chains on my mind are keeping me from being free." And so I thank you again for anchoring this special order, and I thank you for reminding us that freedom is a hard-won thing. Each generation has to win it and win it again. So I yield back and thank you for the opportunity to join you.
And thank you, Congressman Davis, for your passionate leadership. You will recall, Congressman, that 5 years ago, President Obama graced us with his presence when we celebrated the 150th anniversary of the 13th Amendment, and your eloquence this afternoon really adds to that history. At this time, it will be my pleasure to recognize the gentle lady from Texas, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
Let me thank the gentleman. Let me thank the gentleman for bringing us together on such an important moment. And of course, as he reflected on the fact that I think we were together just a few years ago in the National Archives commemorating the importance of these amendments, but also the Emancipation Proclamation. And for those of us in Texas or in places past the Mississippi, if I might start with the question of freedom, we did not get the full impact of freedom until 1865. Abraham Lincoln proclaimed the slaves free with his pronouncement in 1863, and then it took General Granger 2 years to come and present that to those of us west of the Mississippi. This is why I think this moment on the floor of the House, Mr. Speaker and Mr. Butterfield, is a sacred and somber moment. We can declare this a normal course of business, Mr. Mfume, that we're on the floor debating as we usually do, but I really call this a sacred moment because it is a moment to educate the American people. It is a moment to go full circle, if you will, to all of the social justice advocacies that we have done, all of the issues that pretended to divide us. I think the reason is that does anyone understand the legacy of those who are descendants of enslaved Africans? That we had to wait for an amendment to give us the fullness of a human being. We were not counted as human beings fully when the Constitution was written. And so just imagine coming from a legacy where you were not counted as one. You were counted less than one. And until this amendment, the idea of slavery, of which we had been property, counted as property. And so I think it is important to read the 13th Amendment. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been fully convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Think of that. Even indentured servants had a different status than anyone who was a descendant of enslaved Africans who came to this country 1619 and a little bit before. That is what we discuss today. That is the issue of the 13th Amendment. And it is important to realize that the framers never used the words slave, shareholder, master, or slavery anywhere in the original Constitution. That is almost to say that we had no valid space, even in a negative connotation. And so to actually realize why this is so sacred, let me give you some of the thoughts. By 1861, when the Civil War broke out, more than 4 million people, nearly all of them African descent, were enslaved in 15 southern and border states. By 1862, President Abraham Lincoln came to believe firmly that emancipating enslaved people in the South would help the Union crush the Confederate rebellion and win the Civil War. We became a practical part of saving the Union. We became the cornerstone, the descendants of enslaved Africans. The question of slavery was not based upon the brutality of the separation of families, the beating that was suffered, the sheer brutality of it. No, it was not that, and I do not find fault for that era. But people need to understand that it was not because someone bowed their heads, there were the abolitionists, and said, oh, how sad it is that human beings are held in bondage. We became calculated, a calculating force. But look at the numbers. 4 million enslaved. One would wonder why this is a sacred moment on the floor of the House. So Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which took effect in 1863, announced that all enslaved people held in the states, then in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thereforward, and forever free. But the Emancipation Proclamation itself did not end slavery in the United States, as it only applied to the 11 Confederate states then at war against the Union. Remember, we became the practical cornerstone of trying to end the war, to stop the rebellion, and to preserve the Union. I'm glad the Union was preserved. I'm glad we are the United States of America, but yet it is so crucial in the understanding of even this year of 2020. Even understanding the horrors of George Floyd's death, what his family still suffers, and why there was such a rage of young people, and why the words Black Lives Matter came, because of the brutality of our history. And here in the 21st century, we are still suffering from the inequities of those that did not understand not only the question of justice, but also the question of the brutality and the history of slavery. Maybe there would have been a better understanding if a little history was woven into where we are today. As I indicated, the Emancipation Proclamation did not do it because, as it said, it did not deal with the states like Massachusetts. It did not deal with states like Ohio, to my understanding. It did not deal with those states. And in April 1864, the United States Senate passed a proposed amendment banning slavery with the necessary two-thirds majority, but it faltered in the House of Representatives as more and more Democrats refused to support it. So it was not an easy journey. When Congress reconvened in December 1864, the emboldened Republicans put the proposed amendment up for a vote again, and Lincoln threw himself in the legislative process, something that gives leadership and substance to the idea of freeing slaves, freeing human beings. The Constitution now is a stronger document because as he put himself into this, Lincoln and his allies see what is before you to focus on the most important thing, that this amendment protects the slaves now born and in the United States, but also the millions yet to be born. He was committed to the passage of the 13th Amendment. He authorized his allies to entice House members with plum positions and other inducements, reportedly telling them, I leave it to you to determine how it shall be done. But remember that I am President of the United States, clothed with immense power, and I expect you to procure the votes. The whip is on the floor, Mr. Clyburn. I'm all of a sudden elevated in my capacity as a whip because this President Lincoln was determined to have his agents on the floor use that authority to get what needed to be done. And January 31st, 1865, the House of Representatives passed the proposed amendment with a vote of 119 to 56, just over the required two-thirds majority. And so, Mr. Speaker, I started out by saying this is a sacred moment. And I hope the people at home and our colleagues can see what slavery represented, the brutality of the back of this slave. It didn't take much to be whipped, and whipped, so scarred, so brutalized, that you were almost to death. Or to see a family so like chattel, so like property, sold and demeaned, families separated, babies separated, children becoming more valuable than mom and dad, dad becoming more valuable. And I remember reading the slave narratives, and those slave narratives said that a woman told her husband to come home quick, her slave husband, from where he was working in another plantation, because they're getting ready to sell our children in one place and me in another. We need you home. Who would imagine that human beings would have collars around their necks? Slavery so brutal that it was unspeakable and could not be heard. And so today, as we commemorate the 155th of this important step, realizing that it had to go through as an amendment to all of the states, what a journey it was made. And I think the words of Sojourner Truth are telling, and that's why we fought to have her bust, her statue here, when she was at an abolitionist meeting and someone said, "Yes, sir, what do you want?" And she said, "Ain't I a woman? I've borne 13 children, and I've seen most all of them sold into slavery." That is why we are on the floor today. We're on the floor today because of the continued misunderstanding of race in this question, in this nation. We're on the floor today because more of us need to understand what H.R. 40 is all about. A magnificent piece of legislation that deals with the question of the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals. And it is a reflection of the history of African Americans in this country. And it is the simple process of getting a commission that dignifies what happened to us and looks for reconciliation and restoration and proposals to deal systemically with the ongoing disasters that we see in our respective communities, from disparities in healthcare, COVID-19, housing, the criminal justice system, education. That's why we stand here today. So I want to thank Mr. Butterfield for his time, and I want to thank him for yielding, and I thank this body for understanding this is a sacred moment. I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman, for delineating the important difference between the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. The proclamation was a heroic action of President Lincoln. The 13th Amendment was historic action of this Congress. At this time, it is my pleasure to yield to the gentleman from South Carolina, the Majority Whip, the Democratic Whip of the House, Congressman James Clyburn, for such time as he may consume.
Thank you very much, Congressman Butterfield, for yielding me some time to talk on this very, very momentous occasion. I want to thank you for bringing attention to this issue, the 155th anniversary of this ratification of the 13th Amendment. Now, having not listened to all of the discussion before, and I hope I'm not too repetitive here, but I want to bring to the attention of all here this evening and our listeners two conflicting events. Now, we often hear talk of the Emancipation Proclamation. The fact of the matter is there were two Emancipation Proclamations. The first one freeing the formerly enslaved living in the District of Columbia. And that became effective upon its signing in 1862. The second one, also written in 1862 and signed by President Abraham Lincoln,
was to become effective January 1, 1863, and that was to free the other enslaved people in the former slave states, which meant that in those states that did not have slavery, officially sanctioned slavery, but did have slaves, in order for them to be free, in order for the descendants of those from the District of Columbia and those affected by those two proclamations, we needed a constitutional amendment, because as we know, executive orders could very well change with the next executive. And so Abraham Lincoln set out to lay the groundwork for the 13th Amendment. And so we're here celebrating the 155th anniversary of that. But we also, this week, will be celebrating the 150th anniversary of another momentous event. 150 years ago, come Saturday, we'll commemorate the swearing in to this august body, the first African American to serve in the United States Congress, Joseph H. Rainey. Joseph Rainey was from Georgetown, South Carolina, and early in his life moved to Charleston. He worked as a barber. His father was a barber, and he took up the barbering trade and made enough money as a barber to purchase his and his family's freedom. Now, the interesting thing about this is that I often talk about the French historian Alexis de Tocqueville, who came to this country in the 1830s to study our penal system. But while here, he saw what he considered to be a certain magic about this country. And back around the 1836, he wrote a book, a 2-volume book, called Democracy in America. Now, de Tocqueville, in trying to figure out what it was that he considered to be magical about this country, wrote in those books this little phrase: America is not great because it is more enlightened than any other nation. Just think about that. Not more enlightened than any other nation, because we had slavery. This is the 1830s. That was not an enlightened institution. But he said, rather because it has always been able to repair its faults. Just think about that. De Tocqueville saying that this country is great because it's able to repair its faults, writing at a time that we had slavery in this country in the 1830s. And it was some 30 years later when slavery was abolished. Now, the thing that I like to point out is the fact that we talk about all of these things that happened during Reconstruction. And most times, the things we're talking about did not happen during Reconstruction. They happened after Reconstruction. Reconstruction was ushered in by the freeing of slaves in 1863. It came to an end in 1877 when Rutherford B. Hayes removed all of the federal oversight, and this country lapsed into a period that we call the Jim Crow era, starting around 1877 and lasted all the way up to Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. Now, I wanted to point that out tonight because as we celebrate these milestones in our history, 155th anniversary of the 13th Amendment, and we will be celebrating this week the 150th anniversary or the first African American to come to this august body. But I want to point out something interesting about that. The last African American to serve in this country in that century, to serve in this body, left Congress in 1897. George Washington Murray, the last from South Carolina. Now I know J.K. Butterfield will get up and tell you about 1901.
That's right.
When Mr. White left the Congress and left that great speech, like the Phoenix. But in South Carolina, the first state to give an African American to this body, the last one left, George Washington Murray, left in 1897. And there was not another person of color to represent South Carolina until I got elected in 1992, 95 years later. Why? Because of something called voter suppression. And I think that a lot of these former slave states have gone back into history and ripped out the textbooks. And we are seeing voter suppression being practiced today, much like it practiced back in the 19th century when they successfully removed all people from color from elective office. And so I want to thank G.K. Butterfield for bringing attention to this today. It gives us an opportunity to ask the people of the country to really think about this period of time and think about what we're experiencing today. Think about what's going on in the state of Georgia today. When we see interposition and nullification falling from the lips of the President of the United States in trying to overturn an election, much like they did, that ran all blacks out of Congress. And much as they did, that took blacks out of elective office, took blacks out of schools to be educated, all those things, and made it illegal for people of color to even get an education. I would hope that during this period of time, the people of the country will think a little bit about what's going on around us. And just remember, there's precedence for what the President of the United States is doing today. I'll yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Clyburn. May I ask, Mr. Speaker, how much time is remaining?
The gentleman has 12 minutes remaining.
The gentleman has 12 minutes remaining.
12 minutes remaining, and I have 4 speakers. I will try to divide it up, 3 minutes each. At this time, I recognize Mr. Bishop, Congressman Bishop from the state of Georgia. Mr. Bishop.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentleman, Mr. Butterfield, for allowing me to share in this commemoration. I rise to commemorate the 155th anniversary of the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. 155 years ago, slavery was abolished in the United States after Georgia's state legislature ratified the 13th Amendment, pushing it over the 3/4 requirement. This was a monumental step for civil rights in America, the first of 3 constitutional amendments during the Reconstruction period that sought equality for the former slaves and their descendants, Black Americans. Unfortunately, we know that these amendments did not achieve equality and, in fact, outraged many of the former slaveholders. Slavery was the backbone of the Southern economy and a way of life. Systems like that do not disappear overnight. After slavery was abolished, sharecropping came in its place. In theory, free and fair, but in practice, anything but. The Ku Klux Klan was organized by former Confederate officers to violently keep black people in their places. The exception written into the 13th Amendment, that allowed involuntary servitude as a punishment upon conviction of a crime gave rise to what was known as the chain gang, free prison labor, which still exists in many places today.
They're not open to it.
Although the 13th Amendment passed, Southern legislatures enacted black codes and Jim Crow laws, legislation that technically abided by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, but still allowed discrimination against black Americans, maintaining white supremacy and still giving white Americans preferential treatment. This persisted up through the second half of the 20th century, which brought us and persisted until the blood, sweat, and tears of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. John Lewis, Jim Clyburn, Benny Thompson, Hosea Williams, Joe Lowry, Medgar Evers put their lives on the line to stand up for the humanity of black Americans. We often hear that slavery has been over for a long time, 155 years, and it may be long for an individual, but not for a nation. But we should make clear and make no mistake about it that the legacy of slavery still haunts America, and it still handicaps our ability to realize the noble principles that this country stands for, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Keeping in mind that we've made a lot of progress, but we're not where we need to go. There's still much work to do. I challenge my colleagues in this body to keep in mind and ask yourselves the question, what are we doing today to make America a more perfect union for the next 155 years? I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. At this time, I would like to yield 2.5 minutes to the gentlelady from California, the distinguished chairman of the Committee on Financial Services, Ms. Waters. 2.5 minutes.
I thank my friend and colleague, Congressman G.K. Butterfield, for the time, and I commend him for organizing this special order on the 155th anniversary of the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States and the important relationship between the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Since our founding, the United States has been engaged in a constant struggle to realize the full promise and potential of our founding principles, most especially the right for all people, regardless of race, color, or gender, to vote and participate in our democracy. Mr. Speaker, despite the fact it has been nearly or more than 150 years from the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, I was absolutely horrified by the level of voter suppression that took place in the last election. The President and some members of this body falsely claimed that there was voting fraud. While courts have dismissed 43 cases the President's legal team has brought, what is underappreciated and not discussed is the lengths the President and Republicans in states across the country went to stop minorities from voting. Fake vote-by-mail boxes, racist robocalls encouraging blacks not to vote by mail, and the President absolutely sabotaged the United States Postal Service to stop people from voting. Mr. Speaker, the next Congress and the new administration must come together to strengthen voting rights next year. We cannot wait. Those that fought and died for the right to vote must be remembered, and we honor their work by ensuring future generations have the right to vote. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentlelady. How much time remains, Mr. Speaker?
The gentleman has about 6 minutes remaining.
The gentleman has about 6 minutes remaining.
6 minutes remaining. At this time, I recognize the gentlelady from Georgia, Congresswoman Lacy McBath, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague and friend from North Carolina, Representative Butterfield. Yesterday, we observed the anniversary of the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which provided that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. It was one of the most dramatic expansions of civil rights in American history, and for the first time, our Constitution made mention of the institution of slavery. 155 years ago, the self-evident truth that all men are created equal had not been fully realized, but with every generation, with every chapter written in America's story, the people of this nation have fought to secure the unalienable rights which were endowed by our Creator. And as we enter a new era, we must not forget that we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us, giants like John Lewis, Elijah Cummings, and C.T. Vivian, who helped pave the way for millions of little boys and little girls who believed that they could do anything that they set their minds to, that they could become whomever they wanted to be. 155 years after slavery, we reflect on how far this nation has truly come. There are many who lived a century ago who would not believe that America today would welcome the great-grandchildren of slaves to serve their communities and their country and our government. We commemorate that long march toward justice and celebrate all who have played a role in making the lives of their children better than their own. Today and every day we must continue the work of all those whose shoulders we now stand upon. We must continue to strive toward that more perfect union, toward a future free from hatred, bigotry, and violence. The work we do in this chamber can advance the cause for freedom, justice, and peace. And each and every day, I pray that we continue to rise to meet that moment. And I give back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. McBath, for those very powerful words. Mr. Speaker, how much time remaining?
3 minutes.
About 3 minutes.
3 minutes. At this time, I'll recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Kweisi Mfume, for 2.5 minutes so that I may have 30 seconds to close. Mr. Mfume.
I want to thank the gentleman from North Carolina for convening us to commemorate this 155th anniversary of the ratification of our 13th Amendment. And it is difficult sometimes for many of us to look back at history because it was so painful, but it is important so that we understand where we are and how we got here. You know, the enslavement of the Negro, the extermination of the Indian, the annexation of the Hispanic, made in many respects the birth of our republic an iniquitous conception. It was conceived under the concept that white men were superior to black men and therefore entitled to oppress them, harass them, and if necessary, destroy them. We all talk about, and it's been mentioned here today, the words of the Declaration of Independence and how this is a nation that believes that all men are and women created equal and that we're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among those shall be life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. But the great historian John Hope Franklin reminded us that many years after those words were written, we still existed in a society where slavery was the order of the day. In fact, it was the great historian John Hope Franklin who referred to it as the great evil institution of American servitude. So it would be the 13th Amendment that would, to a large extent, end that and give us what we are celebrating here today. But even after Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, it was still several years before we got to the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, and the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed citizenship and due process, and then the 15th Amendment, which gave us and ratified for us the right to vote. So I think that, without a doubt, when we look back on all that has happened, particularly considering how we got here, that this commemoration is important, it's overdue, it ought to be an annual celebration, and I again thank the distinguished gentleman from North Carolina for convening us, and I yield back, Mr. Speaker, any time I may have.
Thank you, Mr. Mfume.
The gentleman from North Carolina's time has expired.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that I be given 30 seconds to conclude.
Does the gentleman ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute?
Does the gentleman request to address the House for 1 minute?
I ask permission to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to all of our speakers this evening. I understand the time has been precious, and I just thank all of you for your patience and your willingness to participate. The 13th Amendment reads as follows: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. End of quote. This amendment was added to the United States Constitution by an act of Congress on January 31st, 1865, ratified by the requisite number of states on December 6, 1865, 155 years ago. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for your patience. I yield back the balance of my time.